Mr. President.
The senator from Rhode Island.
Mr. President, I ask that the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I rise today to urge my colleagues to carefully consider their vote on the nomination of Mr. Pete Hegseth for Secretary of Defense. The Senate is now in the process of voting on many members of President Trump's new cabinet, who will determine policies that will affect the lives of every American. However, I would argue that the position of the Secretary of Defense is unique. It requires the highest quality of leadership, the ability to make on-the-spot life or death decisions, excellent diplomatic skills, and character beyond reproach. There is no question that President Trump has a right to select his cabinet, but his defense secretary should be someone who is capable, without question, to meet the demands of the job and the expectations of those he will lead. They should have the knowledge and experience to manage one of the most complex organizations in the world. And they should be willing to admit what they do not know and assemble a team who will help them carry on. In his hearing before the Senate Armed Services Committee last week, and in his writings and comments, Mr. Hegseth has not proven that he is qualified to be Secretary of Defense. He has been questioned about allegations of significant personal misconduct, including alcohol abuse, infidelity, sexual harassment and abuse, and toxic work environments. He refused to really address or take ownership of these allegations. As a result, he leaves himself open to having his personal history subject to exploitation by adversaries, which is the last thing we need for the leader of the most powerful military in the world. If confirmed, Mr. Hegseth would be giving orders to men and women of every race, religion, and sexual orientation. His orders may result in these men and women risking and perhaps losing their lives. These men and women must trust that the Secretary of Defense giving those orders respects and supports them. Instead, Mr. Hegseth has disparaged military personnel with racist and sexist comments. He has derided diversity in the ranks, and he has openly opposed women in combat roles. How can we expect our military to overcome recruiting challenges, maintain retention, and remain the most ready and lethal fighting force in the world if they do not have respect for their leader? Who would want to follow the orders of someone who belittles them? For better or worse, the industry and workforce that supports the Pentagon is enormous, complicated, and is a huge factor in our nation's economy as well as national security. Mismanaging it can cost fortunes in our taxpayers' investments, the American economy, and workers' lives. It has been widely documented that the extent of Mr. Hegseth's management experience was running two small veterans organizations, both of which he drove to the verge of bankruptcy and had to be relieved from his leadership roles. He has refused to acknowledge this, and it does not seem that he has learned from the experience. Do we want to risk an organization with a $900 billion annual budget to such a nominee? Another keystone of the United States military is that it is entirely professional, unlike many other nations' armies. The United States military is held in such high esteem around the world because we follow the rule of law and the Geneva Conventions. Our military is not like those of Russia, Iran, or North Korea, whose soldiers terrorize and kill civilians, pillage villages, and torture captives. When the U.S. military arrives, our enemies should be afraid, but civilians should be relieved, because we hold our service members to the highest standards. But in his writing, Mr. Hegseth has shown nothing but disdain for the rule of law and the men and women who attempt to keep our military personnel disciplined. He wants the U.S. to, quote, fight by our own rules. But do we want the U.S. military to fight like the Russian military that is destroying Ukraine? or the Chinese or Houthis who show no regard for international law? Do we want to vote for a nominee who will tear down 250 years of honorable service by the men and women of our U.S. forces? I hope not. As I hope my colleagues know, my top priority has always been national security, and I've tried to avoid partisanship. I don't think it has a place in that mission. I will always pick up the phone and call whoever holds the position of Secretary of Defense and seek opportunities to work with them to strengthen and support our military. Whoever they may be, I hope they comport themselves with wisdom, composure, and character that this awesome responsibility demands. Our military men and women, indeed, the American people deserve nothing less from the Secretary of Defense. The question I have is this: is Pete Hegseth truly the best we have to offer? I do not believe so, and I urge my colleagues to vote against this nominee. And with that, Mr. President, I would note the absence of quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Alsor-Brooks.
Is there a precise time for the vote? I just don't want anyone to hear this. Mr. President,
The senator from
I
Mississippi,
suggest the quorum call be dismissed.
without objection.
Mr. President, I agree with my friend from Rhode Island, the distinguished ranking member of the committee, that this is something senators need to think very carefully about. And I would remind my friend and my fellow senators and my fellow Americans that the voters of the United States spoke very strongly and very firmly and overwhelmingly on the first Tuesday of November for change. And over 75,000 Americans voted for change, not only domestically, which we're seeing being fulfilled even in the first week of this term, but also on the international scene. The United States needs to return to a position of strength. And through that strength and through that military might, we can assure peace for a generation. So I think one of the things that over 75 million Americans spoke for on Election Day was peace through strength. The president has made his choice, and he's putting his team together to strengthen our military and to get us ready. And the person he's chosen to lead the Defense Department is Pete Hegseth. The more I have seen of this young man over the time that we've had a chance to visit and over the time that he's been questioned and actually put through a number of trials, the more impressed I am with his character and with his ability to withstand the slings and arrows that we see in politics and in government today. Pete Hegseth is ready to put forward the program of President Donald Trump. And he has satisfied me that he will be a change agent in the Department of Defense and that he's the person we need. He's the president's choice, and we owe it to this commander-in-chief to put him in this position unless he's not qualified for the office. He's a major. Mr. Hegseth is a retired major from the Army National Guard. He's had multiple combat tours of duty, and then he's come back and he's had some struggles. He's had some PTSD, and there are thousands and thousands of his comrades who have experienced the same thing, experienced problems after they came back. But he's overcome those. And those thousands of young officers and people who've been in combat for the United States are watching the United States Senate tonight, even so. And they're watching to see whether we've listened to the dreams and to the plans and to the hopes of this young man as the next Secretary of Defense. I agree with my friend. We should look carefully. But once we look carefully, I think we will decide that this president, who's had this mandate, is entitled to this remarkable young man as his Secretary of Defense. I'm going to vote for him early and enthusiastically, and I urge my colleagues to do the same. And I yield the floor.
All post-cloture time has expired. The question occurs on the nomination. Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Also Brooks. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Banks.
Yes.
Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal. Ms. Blunt Rochester. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Britt. Mr. Budd. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. I got him. Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Curtis. Mr. Daines. Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. Ms. Ernst. Mr. Fetterman. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Gallego. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Haggerty. Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Husted, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Justice, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. Kim, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Lankford, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. McCormick, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moody, Mrs. Moody, Mr. Moran, Mr. Moreno, Mr. Mullen, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Reed, Mr. Ricketts, Mr. Risch, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schiff, Mr. Schmidt, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Sheehy, Ms. Slotkin, Ms. Smith, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Welch, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young, Senators voting in the affirmative: Banks, Barrasso, Blackburn, Budd, Daines, Ernst, Fisher, Graham, Haggerty, Hyde-Smith, Johnson, Justice, Kennedy, Lee, Lummis, Marshall, McCormick, Moreno, Mullen, Ricketts, Rounds, Scott of Florida, Sullivan, Thune, Tuberville, Wicker, and Young. Ms. Hassan? No. Mr. Blumenthal? No. Ms. Slotkin? Senators voting in the negative: Mr. Husted, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Baldwin, Blumenthal, Collins, Coons, Cortez Masto, Duckworth, Durbin, Hassan, Kane, Kelly, Kim, Lujan, Merkley, Murray, Padilla, Reed, Schatz, Schiff, Slotkin, and Wyden. Mr. Crapo, aye. Mr. Cotton, aye. Mrs. Moody, aye. Mr. Cornyn, aye. Ms. Murkowski, no. Mr. Warner, no. Ms. Also Brooks, no. Mrs. Capito, aye. Mr. Ossoff, no. Mr. Sanders, no. Mr. Risch, aye. Mr. Curtis, aye. Mr. Sheehy, aye. Mr. Kramer, aye. Ms. Warren, no. Ms. Hirono, no. Ms. Rosen, no. Mr. Schumer, no. Mr. Whitehouse, no. Mr. Murphy, no. Mr. Hawley, aye. Mr. King? No. Mr. Heinrich? No. Mr. Warnock? No. Ms. Cantwell? No. Ms. Blunt Rochester? No. Ms. Klobuchar? No. Mr. Gallego? No. Yeah. Mrs. Britt? Aye. Mr. Langford, aye.
But they're old enough now to stay with themselves.
Yeah, they're 13. They're fine. I don't worry about
Mr. Van Hollen?
them getting in a fight with you
No.
or doing something stupid.
Mr. Peters?
Baking cookies.
No.
Burning the house down.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mr. Markey? No.
But I've been funny. I've been watching them all day.
Mr. Bennett?
No, I have like a track.
No.
And that's why I see
Mr. Schmidt, aye.
I've been like following them around. And they've been like,
Mr. Booker? No. Mr. Cruz?
but then
Aye.
at like 6:30, I looked at
Mr. Grassley?
about a mile.
Aye.
My mother's 87 and she can't FaceTime.
Mr. Bozeman,
At
aye.
the same time, and I know she's doing it.
Mr. Welch, no.
And he lets me take him.
Mr. Paul, aye. Mr. McConnell? No. Mr. Hoven, aye.
And when I would preside, when we'd go in, she said, I stand up and I say,
Ms. Smith, no. Mr. Cassidy, aye. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, aye. Mr. Hickenlooper, no. Mr. Fetterman, no. Mr. Moran, aye. Mr. Tillis, aye. Mrs. Gillibrand, no. Mrs. Shaheen, no.
So what do we think about this Hegseth? All right. Are there any senators in the chamber who wish to vote or change a vote? If not, on this vote, the yeas are 50 and the nays are 50. The Senate being equally divided, the Vice President votes in the affirmative, and the nomination is confirmed. The Majority Leader?
And I ask unanimous consent that with respect to the Hegseth nomination, the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table, and the President be immediately notified of the Senate's action. Further, that the mandatory quorum call with respect to the Nome nomination be waived.
Is there objection? Without objection, the clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close debate on the nomination of Kristi Noem of South Dakota to be Secretary of Homeland Security. Signed by 17 senators.
By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. The question is it the sense of the Senate that debate on the nomination of Kristi Noem of South Dakota to be Secretary of Homeland Security shall be brought to a close? The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Also Brooks. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Banks, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Ms. Blunt Rochester, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Britt, Mr. Budd, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Curtis, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mr. Fetterman, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Gallego, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Husted, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Justice, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. Kim, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. McCormick, Mr. Merkley, Mrs. Moody, Mr. Moran, Mr. Moreno, Mr. Mullen, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Reed, Mr. Ricketts, Mr. Risch, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schiff, Mr. Schmidt, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Sheehy, Ms. Slotkin, Ms. Smith, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Welch, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Banks, Barrasso, Britt, Budd, Capito, Cassidy, Cornyn, Cotton, Kramer, Crapo, Cruz, Curtis, Daines, Ernst, Fetterman, Fisher, Graham, Haggerty, Hassan, Hawley, Hoven, Husted, Hyde-Smith, Johnson, Justice, Kane, Kennedy, Kim, Langford, Lee, Lummis, Marshall, McConnell, McCormick, Moody, Moran, Moreno, Mullen, Hall, Peters, Ricketts, Risch, Rounds, Schmidt, Scott of Florida, Scott of South Carolina, Shaheen, Sheehy, Slotkin, Thune, Tillis, Tuberville, Warnock, Wicker, Young. Mr. Bozeman, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Also Brooks, Bennett, Blumenthal, Blunt Rochester, Booker, Cantwell, Coons, Cortez Masto, Duckworth, Durbin, Gallego, Gillibrand, Heinrich, Hickenlooper, Hirono, Kelly, King, Klobuchar, Markey, Murphy, Murray, Ossoff, Padilla, Reed, Rosen, Sanders, Schatz, Schiff, Schumer, Smith, Warner, Warren, Welch, Whitehouse, Wyden. Ms. Baldwin, no. Mr. Merkley, no. Ms. Collins, aye. Mr. Graham, aye. Mr. Lujan. Mr. Lujan, no. Mr. Van Hollen, no. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Sullivan, aye. Ms. Markowski, aye. Mrs. Blackburn, aye.
On this vote, the yeas are 61, the nays are 39, and the motion is agreed to. The clerk will report the nomination.
Nomination, Department of Homeland Security, Kristi Noem of South Dakota to be Secretary.
Mr. President.
The senior senator from California.
Thank you, Mr. President. Colleagues, I rise today to address the nomination of Governor Kristi Noem to serve as United States Secretary of Homeland Security. I think we all agree that there's very few jobs more important to the safety and security of American lives than that of Secretary of Homeland Security. Created in 2002 in the wake of the terrorist attacks on 9/11, the DHS, the department, and the secretary and the offices and agencies under its purview are responsible for some critical things, including our national security, working to protect us against terrorism. DHS implements our nation's immigration policy. DHS directs disaster responses to states and territories across the country. And of course, they're responsible for cybersecurity and election security. It's a role that I believe requires complete and total commitment to the safety of the American people above all else, above politics, above personal ambition, and above loyalty to one man or movement. Because for whoever is secretary, American lives are literally on the line. Unfortunately, in the months and years prior to Governor Noem's nomination, and certainly over the course of her nomination process, it's become clear to me that she is not fit for the job. Time and again, she has demonstrated her loyalty lies more with President Trump than it does with the American people. And it's my belief that when pressed, we cannot count on a potential Secretary Noem to make decisions that are in the best interest of the people and of the values that we hold as a nation over doing the president's bidding. So today, I want to take a few minutes to explain my thinking, both to the nominee and to the nation, about why I believe she's unfit to help a department of this importance. To begin with, leading DHS is so much more than about providing fodder for Fox News. In recent weeks, the people in my home state of California have seen just how vital this department and its agencies can be. As of today, multiple wildfires across Southern California have burned over 55,000 acres. They've destroyed more than 16,000 structures, and they've taken the lives of at least 28 Californians. Even as firefighters continue to fight massive blazes like the Palisades and the Eaton fires that have raged for weeks, red flag conditions persist, and new fires continue to ignite. Northwest of Los Angeles, for example, the Hughes fire grew to more than 10,000 acres in just 2 days. But while the fight still rages on, we know that in the months and years to come, Los Angeles will rebuild. But we're going to need the rest of the country to support Los Angeles in its recovery, just as Los Angeles has always been there for the rest of the country. This is now Los Angeles' time of need, and we're going to need all of you. We're going to need federal disaster aid, and it will require a nonpartisan effort from FEMA. Whether it's wildfires in Los Angeles, hurricanes in Florida, Louisiana, the Carolinas, or ice storms in Texas, Mother Nature does not distinguish between red states and blue states, and neither should our disaster response efforts. Yet even as we speak, President Trump is floating reckless ideas like eliminating FEMA, suggesting that states take care of their own problems. President Trump wants to impose conditions on aid to California, while thousands of families have lost their homes and businesses. In a situation like this, when lives are on the line, we need a DHS secretary who will do right for all Americans. We need a DHS secretary who will speak truth to power. But based on her testimony before this body, I don't believe Governor Nome is capable or willing to do that. So yes, Southern California has a long road back to rebuilding our communities. And as I said, we're going to need all hands on deck. Which brings me to my next point. Immigrants in Los Angeles will no doubt be critical in the rebuilding of our communities. Over 40% of construction workers in California are immigrants. But more than that, our national economy relies on immigrants too. Let me remind us, folks, that during President Trump's first term, his administration, the Trump administration, designated workers in the healthcare, food and agriculture, education, public works, and other sectors as essential workers during the pandemic. And those sectors include millions of immigrants, both documented and undocumented. That's right, colleagues. Undocumented immigrants are and have been for a long time a critical part of our healthcare workforce, of our hospitality industry, of our tourism sector, of our transportation systems. And they make up around 42% of our agricultural workforce. Think about that the next time you're in the produce section of your grocery store. If tomorrow President Trump could snap his fingers and deport all undocumented immigrants from this country, as he has threatened to do, our annual GDP would drop by 6.8%. So let's be clear. Do the math. Mass deportations would lead to mass inflation. Businesses would shutter. Crops would rot in the fields. Prices would rise for all Americans. Even in the face of political headwinds, we need a DHS secretary who will tell the truth, and not just to the president, but to the American people. To tell the truth about how the vast majority of undocumented immigrants are not violent criminals, but they're critical to our economy. Instead, during her confirmation hearing, Governor Nome repeatedly made false claims about undocumented immigrants. Under oath, she repeated lies that misrepresent non-citizens as security threats. She even denied the well-documented existence of family separations that occurred during the first Trump administration. We could agree or disagree on policy, but don't lie about the facts. Because if a nominee can so easily lie about a verifiable fact just to curry favor with President Trump, how can we trust him or her to tell the truth to the American people during a crisis? And between a potential Secretary Nome, a Deputy Chief of Staff, Stephen Miller, and a border czar, Tom Homan, all competing for President Trump's attention with hardline immigration enforcement, the Department of Homeland Security will suffer. Other agencies and responsibilities within the department will falter. Roles like critical investigations into theft or into child exploitation would take a backseat to their political priorities. Areas like cybersecurity and election security. Agencies like CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, which is a critical resource in an age of misinformation and disinformation and attacks on our elections. And I speak from experience. Many of you recall that I served as California Secretary of State, the Chief Elections Officer for California, prior to me coming to the Senate. But rather than rise to the occasion to meet the real threats that we are confronting, Governor Nome has stated that she wants to downsize CISA and cut back on our election security efforts. And I don't take those threats lightly. So from national security to immigration to disaster response to election security, we face serious challenges, colleagues. Not one of those challenges will be solved by prioritizing loyalty to one man over loyalty to our country and to our Constitution. So, Mr. President, given her clear, unwavering allegiance to one man over country, for her willingness to push falsehoods over facts, I will oppose her confirmation and encourage my colleagues to do the same. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor. Mr. President,
Senator from California.
suggest an absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Alston-Brooks.
Mr. President.
Senate Majority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate resume legislative
We're in a
session.
quorum call.
Oh, I would ask unanimous consent the quorum call be lifted.
Without objection.
And then, Mr. President, I would ask unanimous consent that the Senate resume legislative session and be in a period of morning business with senators permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes each.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to the consideration of S.Res. 38, which is at the desk.
The clerk will report.
S.Res. 38, to constitute the majority party's membership on certain committees for the 119th Congress or until their successors are chosen.
Is there objection to proceeding to the measure? Without objection, the Senate will proceed.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent the resolution be agreed to and that the motion be considered made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that notwithstanding Rule 22, the post-cloture time on the Nome nomination expire at 11:30 a.m. on Saturday, January 25th. I further ask that if cloture is invoked on the Besant nomination, all post-cloture time be considered expired and the Senate vote on confirmation of the Besant nomination at 5:30 p.m. Monday, January 27th. Further, if cloture is invoked on the Duffy nomination, all post-cloture time be considered expired and the Senate vote on the confirmation of the Duffy nomination at noon on Tuesday, January 28th. Finally, that the cloture vote with respect to the motion to proceed to Calendar 3, H.R. 23, ripen at 2:15 p.m. on Tuesday, January 28th.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that when the Senate completes its business today, it stand adjourned until 9:30 a.m. on Saturday, January 25th, that following the prayer and pledge, the journal proceedings be approved to date, the morning hour be deemed expired, the time for the two leaders be reserved for their use later in the day, morning business be closed, and the Senate proceed to executive session and resume executive calendar number 4, Kristi Noem, post-cloture.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. President, if there's no further business to come before the Senate, I ask it stand adjourned until and under the previous order.
The Senate stands adjourned until 9:30 a.m. tomorrow.